Welcome to this lunchtime seminar hosted by the Global Food and Environment Institute here at Leeds. Today we're going to be hearing from Dr Iona McCleery about her work on historical foods in West Africa as documented in European travel accounts. I'm Stephen Whitfield. I'll be chairing the session. I'm an Associate Director of the Global Food and Environment Institute. We are an interdisciplinary research community working across food systems research and broad stakeholder engagement beyond academia. This webinar is part of a series of seminars that we run through the Institute. And if you're interested to find out more about those, do check out our website, our Twitter feed, or follow the link that's in the chat for more information about the seminars. Before I introduce Dr. McCleery, just a reminder of the seminar etiquette. So please ensure that your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. The presentation component is going to take about 20 minutes. During that time, please do use the chat function to post any questions. And then at the end of the presentation, there'll be about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'll collate all of the questions from the chat for that session. The seminar is being recorded, and the recording is going to be made available via YouTube afterwards. So let me introduce Dr. Iona McCleery. She's a historian of medicine, food, healing miracles, and Portugal and its early empire. And since joining Leeds in 2007, as well as at a number of UK universities prior to that and free time spent in Spain and Portugal, she's done a lot of fascinating research on medical history, and today's talk promises to give us an interesting insight into that work. So without further ado, let me hand over to Iona.
Thank you very much. So yes, as you heard, I am a historian of medicine, health and religion, focusing on Portugal. This might sound quite dry, but I've actually had quite a varied career since I came to Leeds. Major highlights of the last few years was the You Are What You Ate project. So this is me on this side here, wielding a very large knife in Millennium Square. So this was a project working with colleagues in Wakefield and Bradford, taking historical foods to the adults and children of West Yorkshire. So we ran archaeological workshops, school workshops, exhibitions, and went to food fairs. And I learned a great deal about practicalities of presenting both food and history to the public. I've also been involved in taking health on a roadshow, again with a number of colleagues based at the University of Leeds. We took this mobile exhibition to 2 hospitals and 7 libraries in Leeds. This one focused here on health through the ages, from cradle to the grave. My new project is on food and health in West Africa and the Atlantic Islands, particularly Cabo Verde, São Tomé and Principe, and Madeira, using the travel accounts of European visitors to those places. I've been myself to Cabo Verde in 2014. I've been to Madeira and the Azores. And I had planned a trip to São Tomé, but lockdown put a stop to that. And in fact, for the last 4 years, I've been the Director of Student Education for my department, which rather put an end to research, as you might imagine. But I've been reflecting, for example, on this photograph of this market stall. Nearly all the foodstuffs here are from the Americas: the tomatoes, the pineapple, the peppers, the chilies. I think this is probably cassava here. And that is something which has interested me over the years, thinking about those food exchanges. And of course, most of the research is focused on American foods in Africa. And there are equally exchanges of African foods going to the Americas. So I am focusing on West Africa, roughly from Senegal through until Nigeria, and also the Azores, Madeira, the Cabo Verde Islands, which are not on this map, unfortunately, and São Tomé and Principe, and also the Canary Islands. Some of these are studied as parts of Africa today, usually others are not, but they all play a role in the texts that I study. I'm also interested in Arabic sources for inland regions, particularly Mali, and also what is going on in Congo further south. Now, there are a few challenges to my approach. Just a word about this map, which is also used to advertise the talk. This is one of the earliest maps to show the Americas, and it's often studied in that context. So here we have the coast of Brazil, the Caribbean, and what is probably Florida. But what interests me is how central Africa is to this map. In all of these maps, the Red Sea is always red. Challenges: it can seem extremely Eurocentric to focus on the writings of Europeans. It might imply that I'm neglecting African agencies and voices. There are limited resources to counter European perspectives. There is not very much archaeological excavation for some of the coastline that I'm interested in, especially Sierra Leone and Liberia. Arabic sources are non-existent for the coasts, and all of the texts that I study have been transmitted and translated in all sorts of problematic ways, and I often need to read against the grain because of colonial and imperial layers which have been applied to them in later centuries. There are many opportunities, however. These are the earliest written accounts for West African coastlands. They often mention foodstuffs and agriculture. These are frequently mentioned in travel narratives in most languages. They sometimes include vocabulary in African languages. But these texts do need to be scrutinized very, very carefully, and often they have not been. And it is absolutely Eurocentric to not scrutinize these texts, but to somehow see African oral, ethnographic, or archaeological evidence as a problem. So how these texts construct types of knowledge about African foods and agriculture, it's crucial to unpick those constructions. These texts predate or are written around the same time that the transatlantic slave trade begins in the late 15th and 16th centuries. And it's around about the same time that American foodstuffs like maize, cassava, and peanuts are brought to Africa. They predate the colonial period and also predate the monoculture plantation economies that West Africa is best known for today. So today, people thinking of Ghana might think, first of all, of cocoa, which is an American originated project. African rulers remained in control of African food production everywhere except the islands, most of which were unpopulated and did become slave plantations and trade depots. There is also a lot of climate change between the period that I'm studying and later periods, but there is lots of evidence that people adapted to these food fluctuations using local foods. And the major famines that can be documented from the 17th century, and particularly those in the 19th century, can be seen arguably as a consequence of the slave trade, related warfare, and colonial imperial disruptions. And there are lots of major changes to agriculture in those later periods. So looking at periods prior to that can be extremely useful and can help us to deconstruct stereotypes about African poverty, dearth and famine, which are very persistent today. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover everything, obviously, in the 20 minutes that I have today. This is a list of the travel accounts that I'm focusing on for the 15th and 16th centuries and the geographical range that they cover. The important point to make is that I have no accounts by women, and I have no accounts of travel by Africans, although there were plenty of Africans travelling along this coast and indeed visiting Europe on diplomatic and commercial visits. But there are no accounts that survive written by Africans. The kinds of foods that they all discuss include these ones, which are still in many cases mainstays of African diets and foodways today, but they are greatly neglected in histories of global cuisine. They are often looked down upon. They don't, to as much extent, have markets outside of Africa. They were quite familiar in most cases to the European visitors. And this is one of the big differences between African foods and American foods in the 16th century. Most American foods were seen as very new. So I'm going to give really just one example today and look closely at the ingredients of a particular meal eaten by a European in West Africa. And this is this meal written by a man called Eustache de la Fosse. Eustache was a merchant and slave trader from the Low Countries who visited West Africa as a merchant between 1479 and 1480. Around about the time that he sets out, the Portuguese, who claim control of the region that is later Ghana, have, in fact, much of West Africa, have managed to secure, at least within European diplomatic circles, some kind of trade monopoly over this region. And Eustache is travelling on a Spanish ship. He is therefore arrested by the Portuguese in Ghana and is taken back to Portugal as a prisoner. He was due to be executed, but escaped and therefore left us quite a long account of his journey. It doesn't survive. It's in one copy only, a handwritten account of 1549, so it's quite late. I won't go into the problems that causes. So I'm just going to focus on his meal. It really is the first account of a journey as far as Ghana, but this particular meal takes place, in fact, somewhere that is now either Liberia or Sierra Leone, and the rice that he discusses in this meal, we find out later, comes from what is now Guinea-Conakry, or a group of islands, the Ile de los, which are part of that modern nation. There are three main ingredients in this meal that I'm going to discuss. That is oysters, African rice, and grains of paradise. I could talk about goats and honey as well, but I think I will run out of time. So I hope you will bear with me as I go through discussing this particular meal. It's a meal that takes place, he describes it as a Lenten meal. I think from the dating, this was actually probably a Carnival, Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday meal, which would allow him to eat butter. He shouldn't have been eating butter during Lent, but the dating is a little bit vague, but it's certainly February 1480. What I'm going to do with each of the foodstuffs is try and interpret them both from the perspective of Eustache's contemporary European perspective, what would he have expected of these ingredients, and also from what can be determined of West African practices, either archaeologically or in later sources, including present day agriculture and fishing. A lot of my African data, though, I'm very acutely aware is not from the right region, and that modern practices may not reflect at all those of the 15th century. So oysters, he talks about their enormous size, and I immediately run into a problem here because the European flat oysters, or Australia edulis, that he would have been used to, and the West African mangrove oysters that he would have been able to eat, and the main variety that he would have been given here, are both of them around 7 to 11 centimetres in size. And that's from both archaeological and modern contexts in both Africa and Europe. An L varies across Europe, but a Flemish L is about 66 centimetres. So he's saying that his oysters are over 20 centimetres in size. And as far as I can tell, and I am not an oyster expert, only Pacific oysters get that big, and they're not going to have been available in the Atlantic at this time. So I have been reading a great deal about the mangrove oyster, which grows on the mangrove roots, as you can see from this particular image. And archaeologists can do a huge amount with oysters in all sorts of ways, and they are studied in both Europe and Africa, and in Brazil and in the Pacific. Because people who eat shellfish leave these enormous mounds of discarded shells, known as shell middens, rubbish heaps, all over the Atlantic. But they're often places that they become ritual spaces. They're used for human burial, and they are very rich archaeological resources. So whatever he's eating, there definitely were oysters being eaten all around the coasts of West Africa. The size of his oysters may reflect a myth of African plenty. Africa was seen as a place very, very full and rich in foodstuffs in this period. And Europe in the 15th century does experience hunger and dearth. So to some extent, there is actually an emphasis on gluttony and overeating in this meal, which reflects European perspectives, but also a tropical exuberance. The idea of tropical paradise was very important in these travel writings. The other interesting thing about the oysters, he seems to want to eat them raw. And this is unusual because in actual fact, both in his time period in Europe and in modern West Africa, they are cooked. They were boiled, fried, frequently served with onions and spices and put in soups. The oyster flesh was often removed from the shell on the shoreline and then brought inland in baskets for cooking. Raw oysters are hard to preserve both then and now, and then they were seen as a cold, unhealthy food. So you'd need to warm them up with spices and heats. The modern practice of eating oysters raw develops in haute cuisine only from the 19th century. Oyster fishers in modern West Africa are also influenced by not having refrigeration methods quite often. But oysters are a very important source of protein. Most oyster fishers in West Africa are women. Whether that was the case in Eustach's time, we do not know. He does not say. He does not talk about the work of women at all. And indeed, women are very problematically represented in his text. The mangrove oysters today are heavily affected by what's happening to mangrove habitats, pollution, changes in water acidity, salinity and temperature, climate change, a number of other factors. So although it's a highly sustainable industry, it is going into decline. Oysters were not innocent, though, in Eustach's time. They were seen as an aphrodisiac. They were associated with lust as well as gluttony. And I'm trying to explore the symbolism of these ingredients in his dish. The next meal, and I need to hurry up, of course, is rice. The type of rice in this meal was almost certainly African rice, or Oryza glaberrima, domesticated from wild rices 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in West Africa, probably along the River Niger. This is completely different to the oryza sativa that Eustache may have eaten in Europe. It would have been imported into the Low Countries from the Mediterranean. It was used to thicken elite sauces, as a food for the sick, as a medicinal substance. It was a food for the elite. West African rice is usually red in colour, although this seems to be due to preferential seed selection as much as anything else. He doesn't mention it, which is something that I find interesting. There's been a great deal of debate about African rice and whether both the rice and the skills of the rice growers crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade and took root in places like the Carolinas, Louisiana, and Brazil. This was quite a controversial debate, first developed by Judith Carney, but one of the interesting things is that it focused new attention on the history of African rice growers in Africa, and particularly in Guinea-Bissau. And their rice growers practice and still practice both wet and dry methods of rice growing, skillfully managing the tidal flows of the mangroves along the coasts and making good use of iron tools, iron smelting also developing independently in West Africa thousands of years ago. African rice and also millets and other foodstuffs withstand climate fluctuations much better than things like maize in West Africa, but African rice is going into major decline, and where it is still grown, it is often for ritual and religious reasons. What's important for Eustache is that he realises the rice does not come from the immediate region, and he asks about it. And it turns out that the rice was seized in a raid by the Portuguese on a village further north on the Ile de Los. And the whole of the rice harvest is seized by the Portuguese, what Eustache describes as their August. And I find this as a really interesting moment of empathy in this text. This is a man who's very aware of what it means if somebody's entire year's sustenance, their major carbohydrates and staple, is being taken away from them. He understands the consequence of harvest failure, because harvest failure happens in Europe as well, and it affects both rich and poor. This is a culture that is not able to fly in foodstuffs from abroad. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are. And I think this is a moment of realization for the former slave trader that there is something going badly wrong in West Africa at this moment in time. The final ingredient is grains of paradise. Or Melagetta pepper, Aphromoma melagetta, although there are multiple varieties and there are a variety of different peppery spices that originate in West Africa, and we cannot be sure exactly what it was that he recognized, but he describes a pepper of this variety. It's from the ginger family, in fact, growing in West Africa in its own habitat for the first time, and describes it as a very large red apple, which is the seed case. The grains are inside the seed case, as you can see here. And I'm sorry about the fuzziness of some of my pictures. And it's a really, really nice flavour, but it's almost unheard of outside of West Africa. 14 species are still sold as spice in 15 West African countries, but it is quite difficult to get in anywhere else. And that was actually a result of 18th and 19th century, largely British legislation, which banned it as a food additive. It was particularly used in beer, for example. And also the arrival of coca in places like Ghana in the 19th century. Coca provides too much shade for this plant. And also it meant that this particular grains of paradise was no longer commercially viable. So it's not been developed. There's very few studies of its agriculture, and very few studies of its any pharmacological properties. It is, however, an important foodstuff for gorillas. Its name relates to the belief that paradise, the earthly paradise, was located in Africa. Here we have an example of another map from roughly the same time period. And here we have circled here in East Africa is the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, and the rivers coming out of it connect to both the Niger and to the Nile. So this was seen as a spiritual link, and there are a number of African fruits seen as African with these types of links. Another one is the banana, which was also seen as a Garden of Eden apple. So those are my 3 meals. I think I need to come to a conclusion now. My aim with Eustache is to study what he eats as meals, because that's how humans eat. They don't eat individual commodities for the most part. We don't learn a lot from how this food was cooked in his meal, who he ate it with. Was it only for the Portuguese crew and the elite prisoners on board? What were the secret codes embedded in his meal that only readers at the time would truly have understood? Was it a deliberately topsy-turvy carnival meal that he was depicting with religious connotations, a mixture of elite and low status foods? Does it cause him to reflect on human suffering? What does it tell us about African foodways? I do think a close study of ingredients can enable reflection on both historical and modern beliefs and practices about food. And I also think, finally, that thinking about Africa as a paradise of plenty, it is a very old stereotype, but it is an improvement on how Africa is usually presented today. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Iona. Please do post your questions for Iona in the chat. There's a few coming in. I'll kind of quickly take the chair's privilege and ask the first question, if I may. I'm interested to know whether you think any of the motivation behind these accounts was related at all to trade and establishing trade routes in food commodities.
Yes, I think food is an underexplored motive for European expansion. You know, Portuguese have studied this for quite some time. So initial expansion into Morocco, was that related to access to wheat? North Africa, a very important exporter of wheat. We also, fishing, new fishing sites, also very important. So fishing crops up a great deal. But the merchant authored texts they basically look at everything. I mean, I have a lovely example of a merchant trying out elephants, for example, seals, anything that moves gets eaten, birds. And to some extent, this is looking for sources of food. So yeah, they are looking into food constantly here, but I would say the primary grains of paradise have been, I forgot to mention, has been involved in trans-Saharan trade for a couple of centuries, was already well known in Europe. So that was one reason for going. But gold, ivory, and unfortunately slaves were probably the primary things that were being sought.
Great. There's a few people on the chat that are asking to hear a bit more about goats.
I can see that. Yes. Yeah, so I've been reading about West African dwarf goats, which is an interesting species, and I will honestly say I know very little about goats, but it is an interesting one because it seems to be quite tolerant to trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, and you know, it is a very useful animal in that respect. The thing about the goat, butter is the problem I have with this meal, because butter is not a terribly efficient way of preserving milk. Where you find goats tends to be a focus on cheese. I can't find out very much about butter as an alimentary, cooking fats in West Africa, in historical periods at least. And in Northern Europe, elite people ate kids, baby goats, and there would have been a dairying industry that was a byproduct of that. But again, it doesn't tell anything about butter from goats. And the Low Countries was famous for its butter eating. They were ridiculed for it to some extent. But that was because of an increasingly intensified cow dairy industry. So my interest in goats is actually, what's the butter doing in this dish? So yeah, I think goats today are a very, very important animal, but I have not managed to get further into that topic. Honey is a very important forest product from West Africa, and both honey and beeswax were both imported into Europe during this period and later. So I think actually the history of honey it needs a huge amount more work. But Michael Tuck has did a very interesting study of West African honey as a very deliberate commercial product from the 16th century onwards.
Great. I think this one is more of a comment than a question, but a comment from Mama Ujuaje, who says, I understand from Paul Richard's work that Oryza glaberrima was centered in the Gambian Guinea-Bissau region, but more the former, upland and wetland, but more the former. And she says one can still buy this rice in West African markets in London. It's quite delicious. I
would like to try it. I haven't had an opportunity to try it. Yeah. What I did find fascinating is when white Carolina rice was introduced into the same parts of West Africa, it gradually became red because the preference is for red rice. So the seed selection then caused the rice to become red in the way that the glaberrima rice was and is. So I was really interested to read that.
A question from Lucy. So you mentioned that the imported American foods have reduced resilience to climate change in comparison to some of the native African crops. How do you think the reintroduction of these native crops could be implemented, particularly given the now reliance on those American crops? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I understand there are hybrids of the two types of rice, which has been explored as a possibility. With reintroduction, I think it's these crops are not necessarily ever stopped entirely. It's just how to develop them. And one of the major reasons why they've not been developed is actually creating international markets for them. I think is quite important. There was an international market for grains of paradise into the 19th century. I mean, you can buy it online now, but you will probably struggle to find it in even quite specialist supermarkets. I have seen it in a few places. So yeah, I think there needs to be a financial incentive to develop some of these crops more broadly as well. So I'm neither an economist nor an agricultural specialist, so I probably can't comment further on that question, but it is an interesting one.
Yeah. So there's a question from Netsai, who asks, could the travels of these merchants be a hint that wherever they were coming from was suffered from food insecurity, or was it just curiosity to diversity in their own diets? So what do their accounts perhaps suggest about diets in their home countries?
So they don't say very much about, in an explicit way, about what they were already used to eating. So you have to read between the lines. So the account, for example, which comes from an Italian, a Venetian called Damosto, of eating elephants, he compares it to a wild boar hunt. He expects elephant to taste like roasted wild boar, and it doesn't. So I'm trying to read between the lines to actually try and get expectations. And one of the things I want to do is bring contemporary European food histories in conversation with what's being said about African food, because they developed in rather different directions, these research areas. So what we know of Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries is that, yes, harvests fail. The rich can buy in grain from elsewhere. A merchant like Eustache would not have starved at all. But they would have been very aware that there was food insecurity. That there's, in the 16th century, there starts to be more of an awareness of the relationship between poverty and disease in Europe, and major outbreaks of disease. So when Eustache returns to Portugal, there is a plague outbreak in Lisbon. So one of the things I'm also trying to do as a medical historian is also actually interrogate to what extent was West Africa perceived as unhealthier or not than Europe in that time period. Eustache spent 3 months on the West African coast. He never talks about disease there. Disease is something that happened when he gets back in Portugal. And I'm thinking about what that means.
Yeah. So another interesting response from Mama Ujuaje, who suggests that maybe butter in those accounts, could that be a description for a sauce or something that is not butter as we know it?
Yeah, I suspect it's not. It's what he thinks is a butter, or he's looking for, because what you sometimes find is looking for a term. It is quite possible he's not eating oysters either. It's something that has the right mouthfeel or gives in them. And so it's probably not butter. It might well be something else, but I haven't found an alternative yet. There's just something mixed into that rice. The other issue, if this is a Mardi Gras Shrove Tuesday meal, his readership back in Europe would almost expect some kind of dairy product in there. So that's the other thing I've got to take into account, is that has he just put the word butter in there? Could he actually have been eating goats? I don't know. So they are quite difficult to interpret, these texts.
Yeah. And I think we'll make this the last question because we're running out of time, but Igor asks, do the texts give any idea as to the role of women in growing and preparation of food?
Very, very little, and this is something that I am looking into. So some of the travel accounts do, but everything I've read suggests that so women, rice harvesting was, there were gendered roles of various kinds, but women were very involved in it. Oyster catching, if that is what is going on here, is dominated by women the world round, and probably has been for centuries, partly because it was a very low stakes side industry to some extent. The men tended to do the fishing out at sea. It needs more equipment, more investment. Women and children do the shoreline stuff. And they don't mention these things. There is no mention of who cooked this meal, but he has a meal in Spain on the way home, which is rabbit, which is another topic I could go on to. And that is prepared for him by a woman. So I'm intrigued. Why does he talk about a woman as a cook in Europe, but not in Africa? And what does that mean? So I think my assumption with all of these texts is actually what's missing can be as important as what's there, and trying to fill some of those silences without being too speculative. But it's when he doesn't say something. Why does he talk about this? Is a third of the way into his text, and he suddenly tells us about this meal in such detail. Why? So there's lots and lots of questions I still have.
Great. Well, thank you again, Iona. That's been a really interesting presentation, and lots of people expressing similar sentiments in the chat. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Don't forget to check out the rest of the GFEI seminar series, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.